describe what you do? Because you're a clinical psychologist, but your work lately seems much more philosophical, existential. So if someone were to ask you, at a cocktail party, what exactly do you do? What would you tell them?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd usually start with my professional identity. I'm a professor at the University of Toronto. I'd tell them I was a clinical psychologist. But what am I trying to do? For a very long time, I've been trying to understand how it is that people might make sense out of their lives and make meaning and make their lives meaningful in the face of the trouble that life brings. Because when you see people clinically, they're often suffering from serious problems in their lives. Less frequently than you might think a consequence of mental illness, and more often a consequence of the fact that things can go very badly in people's lives. We needed positive meaning to offset that. And so I'm very curious about what positive meanings might exist to offset that. And I don't believe that ideologies are the correct answer. And I don't believe that ideologies are the correct answer.
Well, I think for people to understand what you do and kind of set the foundation for the rest of our conversation here, as you said, your work really has grown off of the work of Carl Jung. And you mentioned that Carl Jung had this idea of sort of these narratives, the meta-narratives that we all live out in some way, and that they've been distilled into these stories that you see in antiquity, the Sumerians, the Old Testament, even in India and other cultures. Everywhere. So for those who aren't familiar with Jung, I mean, I guess his big idea was that these narratives exist, but how did these narratives come into place? What was his idea? Like, why is it that all these cultures share these same stories no matter where you go and no matter what time you're in?
Well, Jung wasn't particularly clear about how they emerged. He made various attempts in his life to come up with a causal explanation. I mean, he attributed them to the existence of something he called the collective unconscious, which would be the deep structure of the mind that is shared by every human being. And you could think about that most usefully, I suppose, from a biological perspective, although it's somewhat confusing because it often seems as if what Jung was doing was hypothesizing the existence of inherited memory content. And he never is really all that clear about how he formulates the concept of the collective unconscious, except to say that because we're all human and because I'm paraphrasing, I suppose, because we're all human and because we all share the same biological platform, I mean a platform that we share even with animals to a large degree, we tend to interpret the world in very similar ways. And those interpretations are often expressed in stories. Stories are descriptions about how human beings act, and our fundamental problem in the world is how to act. And so one of the most fundamental stories, for example, is the hero archetype. And the hero in the archetypal story essentially goes out and confronts chaos. And that's the indeterminate world. That's the world, the confusing, uncertain world, full of unexpected occurrences, dangerous, threatening, and also promising. The hero is the person who voluntarily confronts that and makes sense out of it and establishes habitable territory, let's say. A safe domain, a safe and productive domain. And in that pursuit, especially if it's done voluntarily, it's possible to find deep meaning. And that meaning is an expression of the instinct that guides us out into the unknown so that we can conquer it, let's say, and prevail. And I suppose part of that, there's an existential element to that, which is that in order for people to find the meaning in life that sustains them through the tragedies of life, they have to undertake a courageous and noble adventure, let's say, because there's nothing that gives life enough significance to justify it in the absence of that sort of adventure. And you might say, well, where did these stories come from? And I would say the answer to that is that because human beings are self-conscious, and that's something that really distinguishes us quite substantively from other animals. We've been watching ourselves behave for a very long time and trying to understand what it is that we're doing, both when we're successful and when we're unsuccessful. we've created stories, extracted stories or derived stories over thousands or tens of thousands of years that describe both the fundamental pattern of success and the fundamental pattern of failure. And those stories are encoded in great stories and myths, essentially. So that the successful person is the successful hero who establishes order in the midst of chaos and sets up a domain in which he and his family, let's say, and the community can survive and thrive. And the unsuccessful is someone who fails at that and then, perhaps even worse, becomes embittered by that failure and turns against life and begins to act in a malevolent manner and a destructive manner. So the fundamental narrative landscape in some sense is good versus evil in the world of chaos versus order. It's something like that. It's something like that. And you see that expressed very frequently, for example, in video game structures. So, because games and stories share a lot in common. I've tried to place the idea of the functional myth in a Darwinian context and take seriously the idea that our fundamental religious narratives, which are associated with these great myths, are actually evolved structures. And they've evolved at multiple levels. First of all, they're expressions of our physiological being, because we act in certain ways in the world as a consequence of the manner in which we're constituted physiologically. And our physiological constitution is obviously a product of Darwinian processes, like insofar as you buy by evolutionary theory as a generative, as an account of the mechanism that generated us. For a very long time, I've been trying to understand how it is that people might make sense out of their lives and make meaning and make their lives meaningful in the face of the trouble that life brings.